Attention, please. Eastern Airlines Flight 19, now ready for departure.
Welcome aboard the Walt Disney World Express Monorail. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we're entering the vacation kingdom of the world.
There's enough land here to hold all the ideas and plans we could possibly imagine. We call it Epcot. Will be our experimental prototype city of tomorrow.
Welcome to another episode of the Retro Disney World Podcast, taking you back to the vacation kingdom of the world, the way it was, and the way it is in your memories.
All right, welcome to another episode of the Retro Disney World Podcast, the official podcast of the Lake Buena Vista Historical Society. This is episode 96, Banking at Walt Disney World. And sitting in with me for this recording, as always, coming in from Ohio, Mr. JT Kuzier. How are you this evening, JT?
I'm doing good. I'm ready to get back into it. I feel like we're on a good schedule now. We're just really We're banging these things out now.
Kind of pumping around. Yeah, we're getting on a good, got some momentum building here, which
slowly
is great.
Closer to episode 100, which is mind-blowing if you think about it.
So since we're talking about banking, you have a kid. Did you have you taken Lily or Andrew down to the bank with like a big tub, or do you go to coin? What is it?
With the coins?
Coinstar.
We'll do a Coinstar run like every couple years. It's just the cashless society is just very... You don't build up that coins like you used to.
No, we're going to talk about that.
I still use cash, but the change just doesn't happen as much.
I got change the other day. I'm like, what do I do with this? I don't know. I'm just like, it's falling around in the car. So
I was in a salvage yard tearing seats out of a car the other day, and I saw some coins in it, and I took the quarters.
Do you check the little toll? Remember the cars had the little toll token?
I pulled out the full seat, and everything was under the seats. I found like $4 in quarters, and just
French fries.
Yeah,
all that
it's
stuff,
pretty nasty, but I got some fresh quarters. I'll take those home with me.
There you go. And how coming into us from Tampa, I can see are you? Well, I don't know where you are. You're still in St. Pete area at your father-in-law's, but I can see your hands are a little brown. You've been wrapping pennies.
I'm still in. Is that what you call it these days? Yeah, okay. I don't know what that means. Did the copper used to transfer?
Onto your hands
fingers?
get dirty from all the coins and stuff.
You got city hands. You've been counting money all your life. See?
No. Hal's never dealt with change in his life.
All right, where he's
always been a bill man.
Exactly, and checks. He has ink on his hand from writing all the checks.
I mean, I did use I will say when I was a child, I did actually enjoy getting the rolls from the bank.
Yeah,
the paper roll, and then taking the pennies and putting them in.
That's exactly what I'm talking about.
Getting 100 of them in there.
Your hands.
That was actually I found that somehow fun.
Yes,
I guess
your
today
grandparents would be like, roll these for me because there's no Coinstar yet. It hasn't been invented.
I've heard Hal say keep the change a lot more often though. That's fine.
Yeah,
he doesn't know what we're talking about.
He doesn't want to deal with it. He doesn't want dirty hands.
I just I'm a big fan of the need a penny, leave a penny.
Yeah.
Why or like what is it? Yeah, need a penny, take a penny. Wait.
Give a penny, take a penny.
Yeah, that's...
Yeah.
And on that note and that
have a
voice...
penny, leave a penny. That's it.
Well, let's welcome the last member of the show, as always, Mr. Brian P. Miles, coming in from the city of brotherly love. And Brian, Hammaker Schlemmer, Sharper Image, as well as Harriet Carter, they all had some sort of device for dropping your change into and quote-unquote sorting it. And you got pennies into the nickel.
Radio Shack, too, would sell one of those. And we had a bank here called Commerce Bank that was the People's Bank, and it was 7 days a week, and the drive-thru was open till 8 o'clock at night, and it was a wonderful bank. And one of the things they had was coin counting machines inside, and you actually, when you would bring your coins in, they would even let non-bank members come in and dump their coins in. And before you started on the touchscreen, you could guess how much money you had in there, and if you guessed within $1, you got a prize when they, cashed in your little receipt for cash. Wow. Or you could just write a deposit slip for the receipt and they would deposit the money in your account. Fast forward, Commerce was eventually purchased by TD, Toronto Dominion Bank, which is what their branches all are now, and the coin counting stayed until one of the local news stations did an expose on them, where they had like an expertly counted like $3.14 and would put it in the machine, and it only showed $3.06. And then we went to another branch and it only showed $2.98. And it was a big scandal, quote unquote, here. And they did us all dirty by pulling the machines out.
Oh.
And of course the Coinstar, I don't know what it charges, 10% or whatever if you take it to the grocery store where they have those things. So all the banks, most of them have taken them out. My bank, which was started by people who had originally been part of Commerce, still has it. But now they, in recent months, have started to charge for it, which is, there's a fee attached to counting your change.
Yeah,
but we're going to talk about counting money.
We're going to talk about that. Yeah, we got a lot.
Quite the coincidence that Coinstar comes out, and then there's an expose on the news about all the other coin counting places. Huh?
Yes. But the way I figure it is, if you have I have a ceramic container that I fill, and then once it's full, which is usually once every year to year and a half, I take it in, I dump it in. It's usually about $120 or something like that in there. And it's just like a ritual. And most people have that, or used to have that sort of thing. And it was always fun for kids, piggy banks and whatnot.
We go, and mine always has some old Chuck E. Cheese coins in there from when I was a kid, and the Coinstar always spits them back out. So I leave with my little ticket and some Chuck E. Cheese coins.
There you go.
And we have, and I have, there's foreign currency in mine too.
Yeah,
which
sometimes you got
just
silver
leave in
dime
there.
or something. Yeah,
and so I get that's old Canadian coins and British coins, and then you find ones that are like, where did I get this from? It's from some country I've never been to.
Yeah, that's probably because you went to Epcot and you got it there.
That's true.
More than likely.
World of Nations.
Or maybe I exchanged it at Epcot.
That's right.
I needed to take the bus, but all I had was a $5 bill. I went to First Citywide, and they were able to give me 4 singles and 4 quarters.
We will work with the customer to give that customer the change that he or she needs. If you come to us with a $20 bill, we can give you 2 10s. We can give you 4 5s. We can give you a 10 and 2 5s. We will work with you.
Well, we've got a lot to talk about in the world of currency, money, and banking. But before we get to that, on this episode 96, JT, as always, you reach into the mailbag. We had a lot of different things come in last month for the Kodak memories and our film show on photography. So what do we have in the bag?
Well, I picked a little theme this month, this episode, based on going to the bank, cashing things.
Sure.
As the kids say nowadays, we're keeping the receipts. So I went back to some old call-outs, and this first one you're going to really like. This is from Nick. He says, sorry it took him a while to get this. This is actually from almost a year ago. In short, though, to start this one off, his family is one of the families that cooked a big meal in a DVC room.
Oh, I remember that episode.
This. In Christmas of '95, his family is from the Chicago area, and his grandmother owned a large Italian banquet hall called Villa de Borno. And normally, they would be closed around Christmas, so that year, Grandma surprised them all in July, telling them they were going to Disney World.
Oh,
exactly. Now, this isn't just any trip. This is all the uncles, the brothers, the sisters, like 25 different people there. He was 14, and he quotes us here, which I don't remember this. You guys might, but in '95 in December, it was very cold in Florida. They even had special sweatshirts made with the restaurant's name on it. Couldn't even wear them because they had jackets over top the sweatshirts. So that cold. But they were at the DVC Resort, which was Old Key West then. They went there. They usually had a big Christmas Eve dinner normally, but this time Grandma did it at her villa. Now they had, the family had something like 6 or 7 2-bedroom villas there, all going on during this. Wow. Sausage, Italian sausage, pasta, ravioli, all that stuff was going on. They did it all though, and they when they got there, it was all smelling great. The whole thing, it was super fun. And it was an amazing week he will never forget. But they said it was actually drawing crowds in from the surrounding villas and things. Like, what is that smell? Where's that food coming from? But
you got like cartoon characters floating through the air following that wave of smell.
Homemade ravioli.
I'll make a reference. How will we get? What was it? The Prince Spaghetti commercial? Anthony!
Oh, that's right, yes.
When she screams out the window and he comes running from like 4 blocks away for the spaghetti dinner.
Anthony Martignetti lives in Boston, in the Italian North End, the home of the Prince Spaghetti Company. Anthony knows a lot about Prince because it's something that grows you. Most days, Anthony takes his time going home. But today is Wednesday, and in the North End of Boston, Wednesday is Prince Spaghetti Day.
So, Nick, I'm going to say you're probably one of the only ones to have the big family dinner like that. Who knows, though? But if you did a big cooking adventure in a DVC room like the old infomercials used to show, let us know.
I'm guessing, Nick, no judgment here, but I'm guessing a lot of cash deposits for banquets were used to pay for that trip to that grandma hosted to pay for that trip for everybody.
Well, they did say he did say it closed around Christmas, but it always opened back up for New Year's, and they had a big New Year's party that ended at 2:30 a.m. with breakfast and the whole thing. So
I made reference this year on Twitter at New Year's that when they used to have people would have planned, like restaurants and banquet halls would host New Year's Eve parties. That was a big thing. That 12:30, 1 o'clock, the breakfast. Sometimes continental, sometimes a full bacon and eggs and all would go out, even though you just ate your dinner at 8 o'clock or whatever. That was a big thing after midnight, was before people went home to give them breakfast.
Yeah.
All right, next
so
up.
We're going to do the same thing at Retro Magic. Even though we'll finish at like 4 in the afternoon, you can come back for breakfast at 1 a.m.
Breakfast anytime.
Well, Todd will have
we
his
serve
butler
breakfast
there,
every day.
bringing you breakfast.
Right. And no surcharge for eggs.
No.
Next up, Scott wrote us. He another throwback here. This is went back a little bit. He actually had a problem one time checking into the Wilderness Lodge. It wasn't particularly busy check-in. Everything went smooth, and they gave us the room keys. Once we got up to the floor and then to the door, unlocked and opened it up, it didn't take long to realize that it was already occupied. Clothes and other things around.
Oops.
They quickly got out, called the front desk, and told him what happened. And Scott demanded a manager. Went down. Scott said he wasn't particularly mad, just wanted to get his point across, but they were nice enough to give him a free dinner at the Whispering Canyon Cafe.
Sweet.
Oh. And a nice new clean room with nobody in it. That's the important part.
That's the best part.
And he says, I guess they knew food.
A family of bears was in the next one.
But yeah, that's always a fun story. It doesn't happen often, but definitely a good one.
More often than you think.
That's right.
All right, one more calling us back. This is from David. David says, good morning, guys. He wrote us back in September. He says he's excited to listen to our podcast about Japan. He's actually heading to Ireland currently. When he sent this to us, he's on a plane ride out of New York, and he sent us the images from the whole thing. He looks. I think David's the pilot. If I'm honest, that's the one we've talked to before, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I've heard they don't have a lot to do up there once they're crossing the Atlantic, and just listening to the general channel But yeah,
I started looking at the image here, and I go, wait, that's a little too detailed for the back of a seat back there. All
these
right.
pilots have the Wi-Fi.
Yeah. Okay, last one. This is from Heather. Heather says around 12 or 13 years ago, she was coming through international customs re-entering America. Suddenly, she heard extremely familiar music coming from the video that was playing, probably giving instructions or something. It took her a half a second to place it because it was not where I would expect to hear it, but it was the Illuminations music. Do you have any idea how that would have happened? I'm assuming Disney licensed it to the government to use, but I'm curious why that song and how they would have come about. Also, are there any other weird cases of Disney park music existing outside of the parks?
I have seen people tweet about this before and talk about it before, but no idea on the origin of how that music ended up there.
Well, the other thing too is I saw this and I thought of that. Remember that commercial that played something from Epcot music? I don't remember. It was like an Olympic commercial we talked about at one point. and there was a certain song from Epcot that was played on. It was Horizons, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was played on something. But
because GE had the rights or something. Yes. Yeah. Right.
So it depends who wrote Illuminations and who owned that. And
I wonder if there was, sometimes there's that famous story about the painting that of the Pirates of the Caribbean building that ended up in the U.S. Embassy in, I'm trying to remember where it was now, Russia. The Herb Ryman painting ended up, I don't remember which country it was now. I'm sure someone will tell me what it was. But I suppose Disney probably had some sort of relationship with the government, and maybe they were like, hey, you need some peppy music? We got you.
Tammy pointed out something she saw we were playing that was not Disney related, I want to say, and all of a sudden she's like, oh my God, that's the music from, and it was some stage spectacular or something that Disney did. I'm like, okay, I'll take your word for it. So it happens.
Brian, you and I were at Knoebels, and there was a magician doing a magic show, and he was using the music from Fantasmic, as his finale. And we were like, what's going on? We heard the music, and we walked in, and we walk into this, guy doing his magic show.
Well, Heather, that's not a conclusive answer, but maybe somebody will write us and say, yeah, I was on the design team of that video at the immigration. I picked that out for. We'll see though, but that's super interesting. And if we could find that tweet or where somebody shared the video, maybe we could share that as well. But very cool to hear that. I'm sure coming into America, that's very exciting. All right, that's going to do it because we've got a lot of banking to talk about. We're going to close the mailbag, but if you have something, these came from some of these 2 years ago. So podcast at retrowdw.com. We're always looking for something to talk about. So write us questions, comments, or share any memories you might have.
We also want to thank the torrent, I don't have another word for it, of responses we got to our cameras and camera shop and film episode.
Yeah.
That really struck a chord with people. I mean, we haven't gotten that kind of response to an episode in a long time. And when we did it, we thought, this is kind of a niche topic. And there are a lot of photography buffs out there. A lot of people have fond memories of their first film cameras and film cameras at Disney World. So if you haven't listened to the episode yet, jump back and listen to it. And if you're one of the people that wrote to us, thank you very much. And Todd will do his Film Geek live stream some night that we'll all be here for.
We'll do some hot projector action, and JT's still sorting through those. So on episode 97, you'll hear some of the mailbag from the photography episode. So
I would like to add too that we had a correction from that episode. Abdul wrote us. He says the dark room at Disney MGM Hollywood Studios did not turn into a photo pass center. That's a pin store. And the photo pass is across the street at the old Sid Coenga's.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I mean,
I think that was more my own emotional distress blocking out the memory that what they did to Sid Coenga's. But
So. All right, well, it's time for the continuation here of episode 96. And gentlemen, all I can think of when I hear 96 is...
what's the old 96er?
Oh, that's our world-famous Paul Bunyan's Blue Ox steak. It is a 96-ounce prime-aged beef steak. And if you or any member of your party orders the old 96er and finishes, everybody eats for free.
Not bad, huh? Want to go for it, girls? How about you, Chet?
People seem to like that. Yeah.
I'll try it.
Okay, great.
There you go.
Sounds good.
Seriously, though, has anybody ever eaten one?
Oh, no, not in my lifetime, no.
They were going to split a salad initially, but he went for the old 96er. So, all right, so we're going to dive into the world of banking.
That's a Great Outdoors reference, by
the
way, kids at home. The movie The Great Outdoors with the great John Candy and Dan Aykroyd.
And if you have not watched it, watch it because there's fantastic references that you will hear throughout our meandering over the years.
Especially about you'll never think of hot dogs the same.
No, you'll never will. Never will. And spin cycles.
I was against pontoon boats for our first tour.
So I think we should go into town tomorrow and pick up a ski boat. What do you say? Sound good, guys? Uncle Roman will blow some coin on a kick-ass drag boat.
That's okay. We're renting a pontoon boat.
Pontoon boat? What the hell are you going to do with a pontoon boat? Retake Omaha Beach?
No, not at all. The pontoon boat, you go out and you cruise the lake. You swim from them, you fish from them, and you even bring the barbecue out. You have a great time with these things. You tour the lake in comfort is what I'm saying.
You guys want to cruise the lake in comfort? Or would you rather skim the waves with Uncle Roman in a jet boat?
Jet boat. Sorry, Dad.
All right. Well, we have a fantastic episode ahead of us here. Brian is going to be taking us through a lot of the history of banking at Walt Disney World. We've got history of, just like we went last month, we dove into some of the antiquated history of cameras and things. We're going to talk about antiquated things now, banking, and how it used to be when Hal's hands used to be so dirty from handling all the coins at the end of the day. But Brian, I will turn it over to you. We've retrieved the 96er out of the meat locker, and we're ready to discuss. So over to you, sir. Out of the safe, I should say, not the locker. That's out of the safe.
I had a cash out of the cash box. I had occasion today to discuss with a 30-year-old coworker, who, for those of you of our peer ages, 30-year-olds were born in 1994.
Ow, that hurts. That hurts.
Mind-blowing. But I had occasion today to discuss this pending podcast that we were recording tonight with a 30-year-old coworker. And when I started to explain banking and what you did at a bank branch and why there would have been a bank branch in Walt Disney World, and he just stared at me like I was explaining nuclear physics or something. Like it just was so foreign to him. So I always keep in mind, we're reminiscing, but we're also educating a lot of people who never experienced this world before digital payments for everything. But obviously Disney World and the building of the Disney property, we've talked before about Central Florida and the Orlando region being really a sleepy backwater at the time. Pre-show, we were chatting a little bit about the famous Johnny's Corner general store that was off property, which was really the only place people working construction or working around the area could stop and pick up their beer after work or pick up a sandwich. It was also the number one place for them to cash their paychecks because it was the only place around that could do that. And that was a thing you would do back then. Obviously, if you're building the vacation kingdom of the world, there needs to be some banking support underlying that. And Hal Bowers actually directed us to the kind of the history of how Disney ended up making its own banking relationships in Florida. Obviously, the effort, once Disney revealed that they were in fact the people who purchased all of the acres and tracts of land and announced that they were coming to Central Florida, quickly the governor and local officials and county officials put together groups of prominent local businessmen and support concerns and roads, bridges, etc., all of that stuff. But really the business community down there to create, a Chamber of Commerce network for Disney to rely on so that they would know what facilities and what supplies were available in Central Florida and what stuff they'd have to invent on their own. So through that, through Roy's many trips to Florida during the project and Don Tatum and the other folks, Admiral Joe Fowler, all those guys, interacting with the Chamber of Commerce leaders down there, they got to build relationships with the local Orlando businessmen and women. And through that is how they ended up with their banking relationship. And I'm going to let Hal Bowers, who dug up this fascinating oral history interview with one of those businessmen, and fill in the blank.
All right. So when they came down to buy the property, they had to work with the bank in order to facilitate all of those purchases. And so they worked with the First National Bank at Orlando, who was more than happy to kind of keep things under wraps so that way they didn't reveal, all those little shell corporations that were buying out. everything. And so the guy that was the president of that bank, his name was William Dial. And he was, just thrilled to bring Disney in that business to Orlando, because, as Brian said, Orlando was kind of a sleepy town, really needed something. He was partially instrumental in bringing Martin Marietta to Orlando, and so he was really interested in, trying to bring the population in, bringing good paying jobs, very forward thinking gentleman. After things are starting to get set up, he's at his house, he's entertaining Don Tatum and Roy Disney and a couple of other folks. So Roy Disney walked over to him and said, Bill, you've been awfully helpful to us down here. You've been awfully nice and all that, but when are you going to ask me for your banking business? And he said, this is secondary, Roy. The main deal was to get you here. And then Roy said, well, you have it. And he said, okay, thank you very much. And that was it. That's how Disney and the First National Bank of Orlando ended up doing business, just by this handshake deal. And so that bank eventually got together with some other banks and became Sun Bank.
There we go. So you see the origins of Roy Disney and, what was it, First Bank of Orlando?
First National Bank of Orlando.
There we are. And which would eventually become Sun Bank in the early mid-70s. And there's an interesting side to all of this. There was a law in Florida at the time that prohibited branch banking. And part of what enabled this conglomerate to get together was that they know the law was changed in Florida. So what I mean by that is, if you were doing your banking with the Bank of Retro WDW, we had one location, and you could come to that one location to do your banking, and there were no additional locations. There might be the second Bank of Retro WDW or the third Bank of Retro, but there were no satellite branches prohibited by law at the time in Florida. I am sure some arcane finance expert out there might be able to explain to us why that might have been, or what the thinking process was, or if it's a leftover law from the Great Depression or something like that. But that enabled them then to open branches off-site. So we should briefly mention, Hal, since I still have you here, because we're going to get to how they handled some of the functions on site for Disney employees and Disney's cash, the credit union that was started in Disneyland and how Disneyland handled its banking in the 1950s and 60s.
Yeah, so I think we've all probably heard about how Bank of America was involved with Disneyland. They sponsored It's a Small World, and I know that they were one of the banks that gave Walt a line of credit in order to help build Disneyland. They were around until the 60s. Apparently, sometime around 1960, the studios started a credit union called Vista Credit Union. And then in about 1968, so we're in that run up to Walt Disney World, in 68, the Disneyland wanted to have a credit union too. And they said, hey, can we join your credit union studios? And the studio said, no, you need to start up your own. So they created their own. It was called what? The Disneyland Credit Union, did you say?
It had a number of different names, but it was like the Disneyland Employee Credit Union, and it had a couple of different names. The actual first name didn't have Disneyland in it, but it eventually became the Disneyland Employee Credit Union.
Yeah, and so it was Vista that actually ended up coming to Orlando in the 1980s. Eventually, those two credit unions merged and became the Partners Credit Union in 2007. And that's the credit union that serves the Disney cast members now. And we don't have any confirmation, but we have a feeling that probably it was the buyouts of Sun Bank to SunTrust and some of those things that probably accelerated that credit union coming to Orlando and becoming popular.
Also, the side note on the credit unions, we'll do two things here. The name stayed the Disneyland Employee Credit Union for a long while. And then at a certain point in the late 80s or early 90s, Michael Eisner made a personal request that they, he didn't want to litigate it or anything, but would they please take Disneyland out of the name? And that is when they changed their name to Partners and took the Disney name off of it, because it really was not affiliated directly with the Disney company in any way other than its employees utilizing it. I don't want to get too deep into the difference between credit unions and banks, so I won't. I have an account with both. Not Partners, but I have an account with both a credit union and a bank. Credit union rules are a little different. Some of their security requirements are different, and some of the things that they can do for their members, because you are a member at a credit union. They can offer some lower loan rates and things like that. So I know there's 100 bankers out there listening right now, and credit union people who would love to send in a, brief summary of what the difference is. But for our purposes, it's really not that important for today. So let me do some setup here for what was happening. So Disney World opens in 1971. We know they've been doing their banking there in Orlando with what would eventually become a part of Sun Bank. As a reminder from prior episodes, Walt Disney World was a cash business. They only accepted credit cards in very few places. I want to say the hotels, and a couple other, but you could not use a credit card in the parks. When you went to the parks, when you were spending money buying merchandise, going to the restaurants, I want to say maybe they took credit cards for ticket media, possibly. But almost all of their business was cash. So they were handling an enormous amount of cash. Much of the cash was transported from the shops and restaurants and ticket booths where it was collected in secure cages with armed security through the utilidors. And they would wheel it to the counting room. What I assume, and I'm sure there may be a classic employee out there who may be able to fill in a blank for us, because this hasn't been immediately evident to any of us through what we've been able to read, is that the Brinks trucks, Disney would count the money and then the Brinks trucks would come and pick it up and take it to the bank in Orlando to deposit. Eventually, the decision was made to open a Sun Bank branch on property. And there was a lot of stuff that was happening now. The Sun Bank office building, which I'm going to, again, defer to Hal to shed some light on, but just so you have the process down, even from opening day, from one of the cast members at the time who said, you would not believe the amount of money we processed every day. Large money, 20s, larger checks, credit card transactions, which Todd will get into in a little bit as to how credit card transactions were handled prior to sliding it through a machine and making a phone call to authorize the money. All of that was picked up by a Brinks truck for Sun Bank. So prior to Sun Bank opening the branch there, Disney had possession of the money until Sun Bank sent the Brinks truck to take the money from them. Once they opened the branch there, Disney could deposit the money on site, at which point, before the money ever left property, it was no longer Disney's money, it was Sun Bank's money. And the reason that's important is FDIC insurance, everything is, all of a sudden, if there's the great train robbery of the Brinks truck on the way, it's not Disney losing the money, it's Sun Bank losing the money. And if I know Brinks, I think they guarantee their money deliveries. I think that's the whole reason you hire Brinks, is that they guarantee they're going to get your cash from point A to point B. So just imagine the volume of cash, especially during those busy summer times and the holidays, and just the amount of cash that was being used. So it was picked up by Brinks for Sun Bank. She said everything else got used in the parks, hotels, and restaurants. So one of my favorite was it the Bugs Bunny one? 1, 2, 3 for me, 1 for you. 1 for you, 1, 2, 3 for me. So Disney was doing some of that in this counting room. But as we're talking about these change counters, which they do have commercial change counters, they would have been feeding all of this money through these automated change counters to try and make rolls or maybe bags that you weighed. And so this is all quarters, and they would weigh it and be able to tell how many quarters were in there. And do the same thing with all the paper money, the ones, the 5s, the 10s, the 20s, 50s, 100s. And they would, decide, what? We brought in $150,000 today. We're going to deposit $120,000 of it, send $10,000 down to the village for change for the shops, and $2,000 to the Contemporary for change for the front desk. Like that's what they were doing at the time. It was all done by cash, which is just mind blowing to me. So from Sid Kirchheimer of the Orlando Sentinel staff, in an article from 1977, headline, Bank Services Available Inside the Park. So June 24th, 1977, the Sun Bank branch opens in Town Square in Main Street, Walt Disney World. It was the first building on the left as you entered the park. And you might be asking yourself, what might a bank branch be doing inside of a theme park? And it wasn't just in the Magic Kingdom. In order to give you a complete answer as we go through this, there was a branch at Epcot Center. There was a branch at Disney MGM Studios, which opened in 1989. So you're covering right there a 12-year period. And we'll get into, and there would eventually be a branch when they opened in Celebration as well. When they opened Celebration Florida, which was originally a Disney project, there was a bank branch there as well. So what did you need a bank for on Main Street USA that was public facing instead of whatever was going on behind the scenes? Well, the reason you would need a bank branch in a theme park at the time is because people were not carrying around credit cards, did not have digital means to pay for things. You might have had a check on you that you could write a check for something, but they didn't want you writing a check at like the ticket counter outside of, the ticket kiosk outside of It's a Small World. They wanted you to go to the bank that was at the front of the park. And what they would do is they would cash a check, a personal check, up to $25. So you could
went a little further back then. So
you could write a check for $25. It was a full service branch though there. So what people could do, you could exchange foreign currency. You could trade in traveler's checks, and I know Todd's chomping at the bit to go through each of these things and explain them to you. But they were full service banks, so while they were there for the public's convenience, they were also majorly there for the cast members' convenience, because at that time you got paid by a paper check. On, I think it was Thursdays, was payday. And a lot of cast members, either you would have an account at Sunbank and deposit some or all of it, or deposit. So for you guys that don't understand here that weren't alive for the days of paper paychecks and paper checks, I'd get a paycheck for $426. I would deposit $326, and then the bank teller would hand me $100 back in cash, and that was my pocket money for the week. And that's how we did it before ATM machines and debit cards and everything else. So you had something like 1,500 employees there getting those checks every week, and the vast majority of them could wander after their shift into the Sun Bank and cash it or deposit it. So it was there for banking for them. And they also handled, any normal function that a bank would do. So if you wanted to buy a certificate of deposit, CDs, or money, open a money market, anything like that. They had the ability to do that. It was a full-service Sunbank branch. They would eventually open additional ones in what is now Disney Springs, downtown Disney, the Lake Buena Vista Shopping Village, and the other 2 theme parks. They were all places where they had fully functioning branches. And then was that their headquarters, Howard, that they put in the only office building they ever built in the originally planned office park?
No, no. Their headquarters, I think, was in downtown Orlando.
So it was a building that was the Sunbank building. And it had their logo on it, and the office building right down. I'm trying to think what hotel's next to it or across from it. Yeah, right on Hotel Plaza Boulevard. So it's still there. It's the Partners building now, but it's the only one of the originally planned office park buildings that were to be part of the Lake Buena Vista area that ever got built. And there were plans at the time to build more office buildings and have people movers down there and all kinds of kooky, crazy planning in the 70s that never got done. I would like to refer to, if I may, and jumping ahead 5 years, Howard and Todd especially, to the financial services available at the bank when they opened Epcot Center. And it was traveler's checks, cash advances, that's an important one, foreign currency exchanges, and available. There were 2 facilities on the grounds of Epcot Center. American Express was a sponsor of the American Adventure and signed an exclusive deal, so they brought credit cards into the parks. In fact, you could sign up for an American Express credit card at Earth Station when you got off Spaceship Earth. You could sign up for an Amex card there. And I also want to explain for people who might not get it. An Amex card was a real status symbol really up until the 2000s, when they strategically made a decision to become a more common credit card and give their card to more people with lower credit scores and lower some of the income requirements. That was a strategy decision on their parts. They didn't want to just be a luxury credit card. So if you want the luxury version now, you get the platinum card,
Did it always have an annual fee, even the basic one?
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. The green card was the standard one. That was the first Amex I ever got, was the green card. But, it was a big deal if you had an American. I mean, that was their commercials too. And they were the first ones that did things like extend your warranties when you bought something automatically. They were a concierge level credit card. So Disney made this deal with them to be one of the sponsors. And in exchange for that, they got to be the exclusive credit card accepted at Walt Disney World. So you could start using it in the parks at places, but only if you had the American Express. So one of the benefits of that was that American Express travelers checks in any denomination and cash advances of $50 if you had a MasterCard and $100 if you had a Visa card were available at Sunbank offices. So you could walk in with your MasterCard or your Visa and say, I'm out of money. I want to take $100 out, and they'd run it basically as a charge and then hand you the cash. They exchanged currency from every major foreign country in the world. So if you walked in with Japanese yen or British pounds, or you're visiting from France, they would exchange your foreign money to American currency for a small fee. The bank teller machines, which I think is another side topic that everybody's chomping to go off on. They had a 24-hour ATM at Epcot when it opened. I'm not sure when they put the one in at Magic Kingdom, but Epcot, it makes sense, it being the world of the future. And American Express also operated a travel port at the Communicore East Pavilion in the Epcot Center's Future World. There's no limit on the amount of American Express traveler's checks sold there. So you can go in and buy as many as you want. Now, this is fascinating. When I tell you about how this was a deluxe concierge card. American Express green card holders can cash personal checks up to $1,000.
Wow.
And they would pay it out in $200 in cash and $800 in traveler's checks. Gold card holders could cash checks up to $2,000.
Oh.
That would be $500 in cash and $1,500 in traveler's checks. The American Express booth does not deal in foreign currency, but company spokesman said they plan to start doing so shortly after the park opened. Both facilities were open from 9 a.m. to 10 p.m., the same operating hours as the opening month of Epcot Center. There is a lot to talk about on the side now from this article.
Yeah, and the branches at Disney were also the only branches of Sunbank open on Saturday and Sunday.
Which makes sense because banks, if your bank was open on Saturday, it was open like 8 to noon and that was it.
Yeah.
And nobody was open on Sundays ever.
Right. Yeah, this whole cashless or the whole cash only society is very different. I feel like I don't know if this is the right time, but I feel like we need to talk about what it was like growing up.
Yeah, I think what would be good here is like let's go through. Brian, you mentioned a lot of different forms of payment between credit cards.
Exactly, and
I think we should talk about each of them. So
each
people
one of them
can understand. Now we all understand cash, right? We all understand how cash works. I don't think we need anything, but that was the primary way of conducting business. And actually, also, when you think about it, too, there was no way other than going to get a loan that you could go to a store without any other type of item, maybe a check, to purchase something, right? Yeah. So we're talking when Disneyland opened, we're talking the 40s and 50s here. Right. There was no such thing as credit cards. Now, I think what we should do is...
Actually, back then, there were store accounts.
There were store accounts because they weren't called credit cards.
Before the
charge
conglomerate,
cards.
Before the conglomerates, like you would go to the local grocer, like the town grocer, the butcher. Oh, put it on my account.
Or my
and
tab.
Then when like payday would come,
you go down there.
Jimmy, take $5.50 down to Mr. Nichols at the bakery and pay him for our account.
And he trusted that you were going to come every week.
Yeah, well, everybody knew everybody.
Yeah. And if you didn't come, he wasn't going to sell you anything else.
Yeah, there was no suing or anything. They just would stop selling you bread.
Exactly. So I think it's important for people to know, a little bit about the history of the cards. As we know them today, credit cards, and there's we're going to nerd out here. I'm going to tell you that right now.
Wait, I want to talk about what it was like to live in a society with only cash.
Bronze and gold were tried, and most successful was a disc with pictures on each side.
Along with the coin came the paper bill, backed by a government's name. They both cashed good like good cash should, but man yelled just the same. We need money, convenient money.
That whole thing of growing up where you had the money that was in your pocket.
Right.
As Brian said, the banks were only open limited hours. So if you wanted to have cash, you had to make sure that I'm going out on Friday night. You need to make sure that you stopped by the bank before they close, because they close typically at 6 o'clock. So you got to figure out with your work schedule or school schedule, how do I get there in time to do it? So you're rushing to the bank to try to make sure that you get there before 10.
I'm going to correct Hal here.
Yeah.
Bankers' hours.
Okay.
Used to be an insult. They were open 9 to 4.
Yeah.
They closed at 4 in the afternoon.
Okay.
Sometimes some places had drive-throughs that would stay open till 6. But banks were you had to go on your lunch hour or something.
Right.
Yeah. Or take the money that you put under the mattress because, for we didn't go to the bank today. We need to pay the Girl Scout cookies that just came to the door. You run under the mattress, you grab a 10, pay the girls. I probably bought 6 boxes back then.
Everything required a lot more planning then because if you're going to the movies, okay, I got to take out this much money. I'm going to dinner.
But the killer part to that, How, is you didn't know what the alternative was other than checks, right? Because there wasn't any alternative. You didn't even think of it, so it was part of your everyday life.
Well, other than store, some grocery stores, department stores, it's you wouldn't write a check to go to the movies. Right. It's you had to make sure that you had cash for that.
Yeah.
So it was it was very much a whole thing of like really pre-planning and making sure that you had enough to get by. And once you spent it, it was gone. You know, banks were closed on the weekend.
Yeah.
If you blew everything that you had on Friday, you were done. That was it.
That's a perfect segue into what happened in 1958.
This stuff around is too absurd. Why can't we store it high and dry and sign for everything we buy? It would be great if payment could be deferred.
Aye, that's exactly what occurred.
And in 1958, a company called Bank of America decided to do something, what was called, it's referred to it as this day as the Fresno Drop. And they sent out...
It's an excellent drink.
I thought he was going to tell me it's an excellent story, but I'm glad the orange iced tea is going well.
I'll take the Fresno Drop, please.
The Fresno Drop, yeah.
Easy on the Fresno.
Easy on the Fresno. So Bank of America at the time decided to experiment, and they sent 60,000 of this new thing called a credit card. Now, people didn't trust the credit card. They didn't know what it was. This was literally the test bed for this. So they gave a little incentive. They preloaded it with $300 to spend. And in seconds, it was just a huge success. And people were going to the shops and doing everything. And within a year, they had issued 2 million cards under the Bank Americard name. And that's a company you probably have heard of before because it's now Visa, right? That was the first company that got that. Now, what's interesting, though, you've got this credit card established, and I want to go into a little of the security aspect of it, not to bore people, but to think about how banking evolved from the cash only society that Hal was talking about, to the credit card, to the ATM, to the PIN.
Next came checks and credit cards and purchasing on time. When spending grows so easy, it's hard to save a dime.
This is interesting. So what is the main problem with now this credit card back then that only had numbers on it?
Well, I mean, I would say that there's several problems. One is the person that's holding the card actually legitimately the person who has it. Two, how do you know that this person actually has the money that they're saying they're going to spend,
right,
like in their account to spend?
Right. And it's really slow, right? You're writing these numbers down because this is pre what we're going to talk about in a little bit. This is pre that I know what we talked about on Slack today. So this is interesting
and to your point, you have no so I can tell you as a person that worked as a cash register in the 80s, like you had no direct line to the bank where you could call and verify.
Correct.
This stuff.
There was no way.
You are taking a chance that all of this is going to work out.
Yeah.
In the end, like as a shopkeeper, and that you're going to get paid, and everything's going to be cool. Yeah.
Yep. And I got some great stories about that. So the first problem was it was really slow. You're writing the numbers down. How can you speed that up in the digital? So fast forward 3 years later, Cold War is going on, and the CIA contacts IBM and says, we need a way for people to get into the building that's efficient. Because what did you do before then? Right? Like, I don't know. Did you sign a registry?
Somebody unlocked the door.
Somebody unlocked the door and let him in. Bob's here, right? Yeah. So IBM says, all right, we've got this great magnetic tape that we're using. If we could get it to attach it to the card, like we could use it to like put information on, because like they were big into recording data and all sorts of stuff. So there's a lot of stories out there about this, but there was a gentleman engineer named Forrest Perry, and his wife Dorothea come into play here. And it's basically that his wife sees his wife ironing and decides to take mag tape and put a little piece of it on a card and use her iron to get it to stick. And some people say that it was Dorothea that had that. Whatever, it doesn't matter. This is where it came from. So that is how the mag stripe came to be, which is just a piece of recording tape, audio tape, cassette tape, whatever you want to call it, or DAT tape, whatever, that has can be changed with magnets and puts a binary code on there. And what's really interesting too is that how do you get a technology like that to take off? Like, what would you say would be the best thing to do to say, let's get this out in the open and make sure it works?
I mean, the one thing you have to do is you have to have readers distributed to
Correct.
all the locations that you're going to try to use these. So
Correct.
Yeah. So you have to make some sort of deal with a merchant, perhaps a large merchant, in order to accept this so that you can start the process.
Well, you're exactly right on the machine, but they didn't do the merchant, because what they did is they purposely didn't patent the mag stripe so that everybody got the technology and would go out to use it. What did IBM sell back then? The machines that could read the mag stripe. So now that's how remember IBM cash registers, they're probably still out there too, right? So now we have a technology in the late 60s here. It's cheap. You can make it. It's magstripe. You got readers for it. And all of a sudden, we are now banking by giving this card that has digital information on it, i.e. your number, your expiry date, maybe your name is on there. And I'll tell you, back in the 90s, I did some work. We had magnetic readers for different things at work. And I put my credit card through. And sure enough, there were the numbers came right up. I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. Really old tech. And this brings us to a funny story. You guys remember the airline People's Express?
Yeah.
Remember they came out? They were the first budget airline. Like there was no food. Like there was no food at all. Like didn't matter if you're flying 6 hours or 3 hours, you weren't going to get food. You could pay in cash, check, or credit card on board. And I was listening to this comedian who admitted that years ago he got, before he became a comedian, it was fraud, right? You would just jump on these late night flights, $39, give a fake credit card. They didn't have the mag strip on it because they couldn't read it up in the air, and they take the number down, and these people were flying all over so now we've got a security issue, right? So we've heard about skimming cards, right, where you can get the magnetic data off of it. So how do we make them safer? Chip that we have today is really kind of interesting of how it came to be. So there's a French inventor by the name of Roland Moreno, and he had this idea that we could do authentication. And guys, if you were medieval times and you wanted to send a message to somebody, ensure that they knew it was from you, how could you do that? Right? That it's you who did it.
Oh, the wax seal.
There you go. The signet ring, right? A ring where you would push your seal. Like that's what a signet ring is, right? It's putting your seal on it. So he designed, in 1974, he designed this prototype, took one of his wife's rings and actually attached it to a chip. And he came up with this idea that there'd be these 14 little things, and you would go into a store and you would take your ring and put it into the reader. And, it would read who you were, your information on the chip. It was you. It was your ring. So a digital signet ring. Now, the banks weren't really on board with this, but there was interest from elsewhere that kicked it off. In 1983, so 9 years later, France Telecom realized this chip could be preloaded with credit and used in phone booths, and it just took off to the point that less than 10 years later, this chip that he patented went mandatory on all bank cards in France. So now think about where we are today in the United States. We are many years from 1992. We said, what did you say, Brian? We're 30 years from 1995, right? So we're more than
1994. 1995. So
yeah,
33 years away.
So he made millions, but he got a patent for this, and essentially it became a standard into the thing we have today. But the next really interesting story about the tap to pay that we have is the antenna inside of your credit card and your tap to pay card. Now, this is not inside your phone. You have a different type of antenna, but that's a frequency basically that can be read, and it has an antenna in there. Now, we all know Leon Theremin. Do we know Leon Theremin? You should know.
I have a theremin.
You have explain what the theremin is. Explain what the theremin is.
So a theremin,
why it works.
So a theremin is a musical instrument that has two antennas on it. One antenna controls pitch. So as you move your hand closer to the antenna, you're breaking the radio waves that are around it, and it increases the pitch.
Yep.
So the second antenna increases and decreases volume. So as you move your hand closer to the antenna, the volume gets louder. As you pull it away, the volume gets quieter. And using a combination of that, you can play music, and you would hear this typically in 1950s sci-fi movies.
Yes, exactly.
So usually like a single sine wave.
Yeah.
Sounds very spooky.
And it was Big Bang Theory had one, right? They played the theremin in that. So it's...
What are you doing? Playing the theremin. No, I mean, what are you doing with a theremin? Playing it.
So we're going to dial back to 1945 again, and we're in Russia this time. Leon Theremin's from Russia. The ambassador to the United States is given this beautiful wood carving of the U.S. seal from Russia. And there's a twist to all of this because inside the wooden carving is a spy device called the Thing. And essentially it was a radio that is designed exactly like the radios in your credit card. So the Russians sitting in a room, some short distance away, were able to listen in and on whatever was going on in that office, which is crazy. So it took another, decade and a half or so of years before that technology came to the chip. So now we've got a chip on there. We got the radio frequency. That came a little bit later in the credit card. And the unique thing about the chip is that it randomizes the information that it gives to the terminal when you go to pay, just like your tap to pay does. It randomizes it. So we're no longer in this being able to skim off somebody's credit card and run the credit card through, use fake credit cards on airlines and all that stuff. And speaking of which, we were talking a little bit about, credit cards on the airlines earlier, how we came up with like 7 different names for the device that you would use. I know in some parts of the world, it was called a Zip Zap. But why don't you explain to everybody how before we got to this chip and all this other great technology, how did you actually get your information over to somebody?
Right. So prior to credit cards, prior to magnetic stripes, or not prior to debit cards with their magnetic stripes where you could run stuff. When you went to an establishment, as Todd said, they were looking for ways to write down the numbers faster. So rather than having a human copy the numbers off of the credit card, how would you do that? And so someone came up with the concept of using a impression machine.
Position the customer's credit card on the imprinter base. Press the top of the card down, ensuring it is held firmly between the card guides. Position the charge slip to be imprinted over the credit card by inserting the slip from left to right under the slip holders. The left side of the charge slip is positioned under this holder, and if you are using a 51-column charge slip, the right side is positioned under this holder. If you are using an 80-column charge slip, the right side is positioned under this holder. Move the handle to the right with a quick, firm motion to imprint the credit card data. Return the handle to the start position to imprint the merchant plate data. Remove the imprinted charge slip and credit card. The transaction is complete and you're ready to take another imprint.
Sound.
Almost like a kitchen mandolin, if you
Yeah, exactly.
Right? And it had suction cups on the bottom sometimes.
Yeah, so that way it wouldn't scoot around on the table.
Because you were giving it a good...
Right. And so there's a roller on the bottom that would push the carbon paper against the number on the credit card and leave an impression on the paper receipt. And then you would take the paper receipt and hand it to the shopper. They would sign their name on it, and then you would check the signature that was on the back of the credit card to make sure that it matched the signature that was on the sheet. And then you knew that you had a good transaction as far as you were concerned, that it was not fraud.
And those, I remember you would even get them, they would do them at the gas station, right? You'd hand your card over and they'd come back to you with that little like a plastic tray. I mean, you're the motor guy. You remember all that. They're collectible now too, right?
I mean, I started driving in like 2001. So it's a little different, but I did want to speak. We had one when I was at Sears. It wasn't the left-right slide. It was more of a vertical, like push-down handle to get the imprint. Yeah, and that only came out when the network was down or the credit card reader wouldn't, like once a year. It was just under there as a backup.
Yeah.
But the gas station one, same thing. And the little you'd get the same little receipt. Like an A&W,
and they'd hand you this little piece of
Type
plastic.
1
Your
or
card
something
would
like
be,
that.
given
Thing,
back to you in this little
clipboard.
holder, and they give you the pen. When Roland had this idea of the signet ring, so to speak, or this digital ring, he added something that became standard into what we have today in ATM cards, which is what's that other level of security we have with our ATM cards? The PIN. Exactly. So he added that into his patent. And after this was mandatory in France, the PIN took off as a way not for ATM card authentication, but for credit card authentications. And it's still used to this day. If any of you have ever traveled to Europe and you give them your credit card, the system finally now in 2025, 35 years later, sometimes will come back with a PIN, and you can call your credit card company up and set up a purchase PIN for international. If you ever see somebody in a foreign country roll their eyes, then this thing starts spitting out like 600 receipts at them, and then they're like, I don't have a pen, because they don't use pens and they don't use cash, and everything's all automated. But they have been using that for so long, while we still struggle here in the United States to get out of this, silly signature thing. And gentlemen, other than your ATM, do you have a PIN on your credit card that you know of? Probably not. Yeah, but you're never asked for it. We still consider the physical card. You must be who you are, which we can get into the whole security thing, which I think is just crazy. But anyway,
so that's actually, we'll say that's interesting. So that's requiring an immediate data transmission then between the reader and then so I can recall during the 1980s when I was working at Camelot Music, thank you, and also at Spencer Gifts, because data transmission did not happen instantaneously between the point of sale system and the back end. You would wait until the store closed, and because everything was on a super slow, like 300 baud modem,
right?
You would do all these when we finally got to the point where there were swipe credit cards, you would swipe the card and still do the paper, so that way you had a backup in case something went wrong.
Yeah.
It would wait until midnight, and then it would start transmitting the information to, from your computer on the point of sale on the cash register.
Like in a batch process, right?
It would batch it at night over to the mainframe. And that's probably when it would start the reconciliation process of reaching out to the bank and seeing whether or not there was actually any money behind. Well, I guess that's the thing about, but prior to the debit card, where you were actually worried about, can I do this transaction or not? The credit card, you were assured the line of credit up to whatever your credit limit was.
Sure.
And I'm sure they probably let you go over.
But that's still the problem to
20,
this day
40
with
bucks,
the credit
whatever,
card.
because your credit card initially was due at the end of the month. Like there was no rollover of a balance. And the first credit cards were like, you got a $300 credit limit. If you spent the $300, you paid them $300 at the end of the month, period.
Right.
That's how American Express worked. It wasn't an extension of a line of credit until much later.
Right. And, it's amazing that when you think about this, to this day, if you have the physical card here in the United States, it's considered legit, which is crazy when you think about it. Like
like I said, we used to check the signature against the
But again, some of the cards don't even have
anymore,
signature
though,
lines.
you know?
No, but how safe is that? Because I can learn your signature if I have a card, right? Like,
I used to get people at Sears that they would try to trick me as a cashier, and they would write CID on the back, and I'd be like, "Hey, let me see your ID," and they'd be like, "Nah, you're looking at the back, aren't you?" And I'd be like, "Yeah, I am, just not."
Yeah, and nobody. You're right. That was a way of making sure that if somebody physically got your card. So we still have a problem here in the U.S. While the rest, I shouldn't say rest, but a good portion of the world has adopted a PIN code even on credit card transactions.
I mean, I just use Apple Pay, and I don't have to worry about anything. I pay with my watch.
Well, that's just as but
just get an iPhone, Todd. And
if somebody can get into your iPhone or your Android,
nobody can.
Okay, all right. Well,
I'll give it to you. You can do whatever you want.
That's fine. That's fine. Well, we're not talking about that technology yet. We're talking about banking and that stuff. So, all right. So the internet is now upon us, and all of a sudden it's the 90s. And how are you going to use a credit card for something else? And there's an industry that has always kind of been on the bleeding edge of technology and helping push things. So, pardon us here. We're going to dive into the adult industry here.
Oh,
for
I
a
was
little
right.
bit.
Yeah.
You were right. Yes. So, pre-internet, if you wanted to buy something adult, you either had to go to a specialty store, or you might have to send a check, wait for that brown package to come back, nondescript, or get what was it called? If you don't have a checking account, you get the
a money order.
What's it called? Money order. Thank you. Yes, which is basically a check that is backed by the post office of the bank. So here comes a time now where the 1-900 numbers are coming into play, and if anybody doesn't know anything about the 1-900s, there were a pay number where you would call up and sometimes it would charge back to your phone account. But prior to that, these 900 numbers, you had to give a credit card over the phone. So all of a sudden, there's rampant fraud in the adult phone relationship sector. And
probably the horoscope one too. Who was that one lady? That
was
on
Miss
late
Cleo.
Night? I forget her name. Yeah, Miss Cleo. Those were 900 numbers
right.
too.
Yeah, exactly. So there was a company that came, the fraud was crazy. So what they had to do was the banks were getting really upset with this. And they came up with what they called, it was this very early, the electronic authorization system. And what it didn't go back to the bank. It analyzed the phone numbers that people were dialing in with and whether or not they had actually called in with that number before. So if you were dialing this number from your phone number 123 all the time, they knew you were pretty legit. You've been calling in.
They knew he was legit.
Right.
They knew how.
But if JT gets your credit card number and calls in from phone number 567, they're like, whoa, wait a minute. This is now. So by doing this, this was very primitive, but they were actually to cut down the fraud. And they had estimated that before this, 25% of transactions had to be returned in this industry, which is crazy. So essentially, the way I'm saying is because they proved that there is a way to do this safely, right? And as things changed, you had to adapt to that. So what do you do? And that is what we were going to talk about here a little bit, is that what is the other security on your card that you have today? And
the CVV on the back?
Yeah, the CVV, which is, does anybody know what it stands for?
No.
Card verification value. So that's a random 3, or actually if you had Amex, it's 4. Amex also prints a number on the front of your card that can be used too. And the idea with the CVV is that nobody can store that number because your PIN is stored, right? Your PIN has to be known by the bank and you have to know your PIN, but your CVV is never stored at the vendor, it's stored with your bank. So when you send that CVV code along with your credit card information, they send it to the bank. The bank says the CVV code matches. Nobody stores that data if they're processing data correctly, because that data should not be stored. And that's an additional layer. The problem with CVV code is we printed on the back of every card.
Right.
So how much better is that? Again, going back to 1992 in France, all of a sudden everybody uses PIN codes that nobody knows it's not printed and it's not stored, and it's crazy.
Unless you write it on the back of your card because you can't remember your PIN.
Exactly.
Well, then my American Express, their code's on the front of the card all the time.
Yes, they do print them on the
That
front.
seems
and
even worse. You only have to scan one or take a picture of one side of the card to steal somebody's identity.
So, again, these CVVs were entered. We all got used to them in the late '90s, and I just find this really, really interesting because theoretically somebody could run. There's only 3 digits. There's only 1,000 possible combinations, right? So theoretically, you could randomly go through all those, but the computers now are smart enough that if you try 6 times, it's going to stop the card, or 5 times, or whatever. So the reason I'm saying all this banking stuff is I want everybody to see how far it has come in 50, 60, 70 years. And we're still at points where the challenge of banking to this day, and I'm not getting into crypto. I'm sorry, I'm not talking about that. But how your physical card has changed so much and the history behind it. Now, I will say, if you enjoy this, there is a fantastic show, because I paraphrased a lot from the show, called The Secret Genius of Modern Life. It's a show that comes out of the UK. One of their episodes was on the credit card that told all this story, and I kind of paraphrased what their telling of it is. Fantastic watch. I think it's season 1, episode 5 or 6, something like that. But I just wanted to put in perspective of what has transpired in a short period of time to change the way we do digital banking, because I think that's an important part of the story, because it is what, I don't want to say took away, but it did remove the need for the cash and need for the bank and the need for the traveler's checks and everything that was so prominent in these banks as well as stores and, on Main Street, USA, the bank there. So I hope you enjoy that, gentlemen. A little technology geek trip here. So,
as an aside, before I jump back into the branches that were in the parks, a big change also came really in the 2000s, was the shift from getting a printed weekly paycheck or biweekly paycheck to the direct deposit. And that was a slow transition, but once it took off, and a lot of that had to do with, over time, companies used to have their own in-house payroll departments. That was what I was hired as, was a payroll clerk in 1999. My job quickly evolved into other things. I still do the payroll, but when I started there, I manually entered into a computer program that also handled all the job costing for our various construction and land development projects. I entered every single hour someone worked was assigned to a job. So all that helped with our bookkeeping and job costing, accounting side of what's it costing us to build this home or this building or what we're doing here. On the flip side, that there was also a payroll module. So the time I entered, if I entered half hours, 40 hours of straight time and 4 hours of overtime, all assigned to these different jobs, then in my payroll module, it would calculate. At that time, I had about 300 employees. I had manually entered every single line of code to create what would ultimately become your paycheck. It would calculate your taxes and all. Now imagine before VisiCalc came out in 1979, the spreadsheet for the Apple II, the first computerized spreadsheet. That accounting was being done by hand and adding machines. I mean,
mind-blowing, yeah.
Which is mind-blowing. Now, there's of course, they'll talk about IBM punch card machines and things like that, but really the actual accounting work was still being done manually by people, just doing keystrokes on printing calculators and things like that.
Probably unless you worked for a very large company that had made an investment in
Right.
mainframes, yeah.
So, in my case, I would then, after everything was entered, it was a DOS-based system. I would hit calculate gross to net for everybody, the computer actually, like, you could see the progress happening, like downloading something at 300 baud, where it was working through each of these entries to come up with what your net paycheck would be and what the federal taxes were owed and everything. And then I would have to line up exactly blank check stock onto my printer, onto my dot matrix printer. And then it would, the entire office would have to listen to me print 300 paychecks.
And if you were off or it crept, it would start putting it in the wrong space.
No.
Yeah.
Well, you're right. So I had after the first couple of weeks, you know exactly where it's got to line up. And then it would print those checks, and then I had to take them. Now, you might understand at this point, I have a connected set of 300 checks with daisy wheel lines on both sides to feed it. I would then take it into the vault where we had plates with the signature of the company president on it, and it would run through an inking machine that would, in a rainbow ink, place the president of the company's signature on the check. Then there was a second check line where the longest serving employee in the company's history would manually sign his signature to all 300 checks. And then I would get them back. At some point in between, by the way, before I guess I gave them to Bill, I would separate them and rip the sides off.
Gosh.
So I would tear 3. And then when they came back to me, I had to put them in an envelope. And then sort them by who they went to be distributed the next, on Friday.
Did they at least have the little cellophane window so the name would show through?
They did have the little cellophane window, and I had to be sure to line everything up to make sure they went in there. It was a big deal when I talked them into getting me self-sealing envelopes so that I didn't have to manually seal.
Oh my gosh. Did you lick them or did you have the little...
didn't. Well, actually, to be honest with you, I mean, we're talking about the construction industry. Their superintendents didn't want them sealed, so I just used to tuck it in because they wanted to look and make sure the guys weren't at padding their hours or stuff like that. But yeah, and I did that for years, and then we switched to a system where I did a lot of the same work, and it was printed in a laser printer where they would come out already kind of sheet by sheet. I'd still have to tear off the top part that we retained. And Bill still signed them, but the president's signature was automatically put on there. The reason I'm telling you all of this is by 2007, we began to transition to third-party payroll services, in our case, Paychex. But Paychex, ADP, there's some others out, Paylocity, there's others out there that do it now. But that was a big part of the transition as companies started to outsource the actual payroll. Direct deposit became a much bigger thing because doing it in-house was not nearly as easy. I mean, I transitioned to it in 2004. Actually, in preparation for this episode, I wanted to see when we finally did it. But yeah, so direct deposit, where your money, you are no longer going to the bank to deposit your paycheck, that changed. I mean, it had to be half the bank's traffic, because every week people would physically go and deposit their paycheck. Which brings me back to the Main Street USA branches and the branches in the parks. Go ahead.
I do have one question, Brian. Did you still hand out everybody paper receipts?
Oh, like at the bottom where you rip it off.
Of like
right?
how
This
much
pay
you got
stub.
paid? Did you just...
Yeah.
I will tell you, there are still some workers today who, we have about 6, most of them, actually all of them older, who insist on getting a paper check still. So I have like 6 who don't do direct deposit. And there are still a bunch who, even though Paychex has an app, you get the notification, you can look at your check stub, you can log in online and look at it, you can print it up if you needed to. A bunch of the construction laborers out in the field still want to get a paper check stub every week. So it's where a check would normally be. It's just like a non-negotiable sheet of paper. And then you turn it over and it's the normal check stub you would have gotten. And yeah, so there are still people who, when we first transitioned to it, everybody still got a stub every week. You know, it was just direct deposited. Over time, we've shifted in the past 3 or 4 years to paperless payroll for the most part. But there's there are some old timers who hang on. A lot of places have forced people in the last 10 years, like a paper check is no longer an option. And used to be government benefits, Social Security, things like, my grandmother and them, they waited for, the 4th of the month, my Social Security check comes. I don't even think you're allowed to get a paper check anymore from Social Security. I think they require you to have direct deposit. Somebody could correct me on that, but I think they no longer permit new people enrolling to actually get a paper check mailed to them.
The cost and the waste and all that.
Oh, there's so much fraud too. I mean, it's if you've ever gotten a tax refund check or anything in the mail, it's obviously a check. And but tax refunds now, same thing. That most people just give them the banking information. It gets deposited. So that's why so many local branches of places have consolidated and closed down and all. But yeah.
I wanted to tack on one other thing, Brian, too, is that when you'd go to the bank to cash your paycheck, you also may want to put something into savings. And you would bring your passbook along with you.
Passbook savings accounts were a thing.
Yeah, which I had one as a kid, and a passbook is a physical book that you would present to the teller.
It's a lot like KidCot.
There you go.
Where you had those little passports in World Showcase for kids.
And it was a printed register of your transactions with the bank for your savings account. Now, the interesting thing is that if you didn't go to the bank for 2 or 3 years, you didn't know what your interest was. So sometimes you just bring your passbook and say, update my account balance, and they'd show you how much interest and any transactions that you may have done outside. But you can't do transactions outside of your passbook back then. So it was only what happened when you went to the bank, because you weren't doing transactions in an ATM. You weren't doing, so your ledger, your register was physically in your hand. And the second you stepped out the door, that number was already inaccurate because your interest had already started accruing. So the only way to get the accurate update was to go deposit. And I remember, Christmas, you get, oh, wow, look, I got $25 from, Aunt Karen, and I got $5 from here, and you go and you put it in. They're like, oh, Todd, you haven't deposited in 6 months. You have an extra $1.63. Whoa, and you were thrilled. But look up Passbook. There's great photos of it online.
The differentiation there is when you would look at available bank products, there would be a Passbook savings account, which was usually for younger people, a statement savings account, which meant you got mailed a bank statement every month to tell you all the transactions and what your balances were. And that was the real difference between them. And passbooks were usually free because they were intended for low balance and low transaction accounts. And then sometimes banks would charge you. I remember checking accounts was like, free checking account up to 12 transactions a month or something. And then there'd be fees. We should also talk about ATMs without getting into too deep into them right off the bat. It was normal for ATMs to have fees even with your own bank. It's become a little bit more of a competitive marketing thing now, where if you draw from your own bank, you don't get charged anymore. Or where I live, Wawa, actually where it's up and down the East Coast now, Wawa, but Wawa, that was their big hook. Their deal with PNC is there's no charges, no fees no matter what bank you're with, if you withdraw money in a Wawa. But when I started getting my first bank accounts and debit cards to use at an ATM machine, if it was on your bank, you paid 25 cents for every withdrawal. And if it was on an outside bank, it was 75 cents. And that was in the early 90s.
So they started out free, and then at some point the banks went into the regulators and said, hey, we want to start charging a nominal fee in order to use this service. And so that was added, I think, in the 80s.
I'll give you a quick side story on that. In the 1990s, I was doing some work for our local congressman, and the chairman of the House Banking Committee from Iowa, a man named Jim Leach, came in to make an appearance on our congressman's behalf. And I was going to be at the event. I was a young man at the time, I mean, very young. And he just said, the congressman said, whatever you do, don't bring up ATM fees. He gets really angry about it. So, because I guess everybody brings them up, and he's like, I'm not doing anything about it. It's the banks can charge you what they want. It's not something you have to do. But I would now, Todd, like to jump back into the branches in the because there was a great article written in Eyes and Ears after the Epcot branch was opened that where they featured the woman who opened the first Sunbank branches on property and kind of talked about each of the people who ran them and what they did in them. And they do tell the story in here how about Billy Dial, but one of the details we left out was when Florida did away with its requirement or a prohibition on branch banking, the Sun Bank on Main Street, USA was the very first branch bank in the state of Florida. So that is a piece of history that you should know and should point out to everybody to bore them to tears as you walk through the gates of the Magic Kingdom, and they'll be like, I don't care. But you'll be like, I heard it on Retro WDW. So at this time, Sunbank operated 3 branches on Disney property. We already said the first opened in Main Street, USA, June 26, 1977. The Walt Disney World Village opened July 12th, 1978, and Epcot Center opened the day of the park, October 1st, 1982. Each office's furnishings and layouts are specifically modeled after a theme. Main Street operates a turn-of-the-century Walt Disney, which was complete with costume. Walt Disney World Village office was decorated to depict the Bank of the Future, and of course, Epcot Center's office follows Future World's theme. They mention Barbara Hargadon, who was the resident vice president and manager, 25-year veteran of banking. She managed Walt Disney World's branches since the opening of the Main Street office, and she'd been employed by Sunbank for 13 years. And she actually, I think we looked it up, had lived a ripe old age, passing away at 95, long after she retired. But important to this is the fundamental, the Main Street office was to be remodeled in the near future. This was, I think, 1983 this article was written. The main office will be remodeled in the near future to the delight of the branch's utility, all-purpose tellers, and to cast members that frequent the branch on payday. The office will be adding office and storage space and a walk-up window in the back of the bank on the cast side, so they didn't have to go on stage to do their banking. Improvement to assist in crowd control and ensure faster, more efficient services are being completed at the village office, and soon 2 new drive-through windows will open and already in place for crowd control ropes in the lobby area. So I'm assuming that's in the Sunbank building.
And I remember the drive-throughs because,
I think they're still there for partners. They're still there for partners. Although Sunbank NA encourages direct deposit, now this is 1983, checks are credited to your account on Wednesday. Cast members dropping by one of the Walt Disney World branches can receive the following services: loans, wire transfers, MasterCard and Visa cash advances, cashing a personal check, traveler's checks, foreign exchange, opening a new account, money orders, cashier's checks, and of course, as a combined convenience for cast members only, Sunbank NA provides several Sunbank 24 automated teller machines in different locations throughout the property. I'm assuming that means backstage.
So I'm on a vacation. I just want to go to the bank and open an account. I think I'm just going to open an account down here, Walla.
You can do that, but they mentioned that Thursday was payday. Earlier in the article, Barbara Hargadon mentions that the Main Street branch, their tellers assigned on Thursdays handle about 1,500 transactions. So you had 1,500 cast members going in there to cash or deposit their paychecks on any given Thursday.
And, it's funny because growing up, I remember going out to dinner or going someplace, and I remember commenting, or my parents commenting, "Oh, wow, it's really busy. Oh, it's payday." Right? And Thursday,
yeah.
people were in the stores. They had that cash because, remember, and my parents grew up, when credit cards were just starting and all that stuff. So the payday thing was much more ingrained in their heads. And a lot of people are still getting paid by check. And you had your cash. All of a sudden you could, it was depleted over the course of, I don't know, Brian, you tell me, when did pay become more of a biweekly rather than a weekly thing?
Again, you would look to third-party payroll
as they came into
providers,
play.
Because, I being land development / our roots are as a construction company, we are a dinosaur. We are still a weekly payroll operation. Very, very few places do that anymore. Most of them are either every other week without specificity, or on the 15th and the last day of the month, whatever that is. And some places do one check a month, where the first of the month you get your $4,000 or whatever, and you better make your money last for the month.
I remember being furious when the company I worked for changed from weekly to bi-weekly or bi-monthly.
Bi-monthly to
because I was just like, I am so accustomed to I get my paycheck, I take so much out for cash to spend that it throws everything off.
Yep.
Yeah, the other interesting thing about that, the whole 26 versus 24 pay period screws a lot of people up, because when you go to the 26, you have what I would 2 months a year are quote unquote a triple paycheck month. So if you budget on 2 paychecks, you have this weird month where you get 2 months where you get 3 paychecks, and it's a little weird. It's definitely easier on the 24 because hey, I'm being paid on the 1st and the 15th, and that's it.
And I will say, in my due diligence, in my 26 years in this job, I have several times suggested moving to every other week.
Yeah.
Just as it's not that it would it would give me a little less to do, but, just as do you want to do this? Because we get charged every payroll that they run.
So if you can do it 24 versus 26, times that by 10 years.
When I had to quantify it in dollars, it's been years since I've done it, but it was something along the lines of, look, we'll save $5,000 or $6,000 a year by doing it this way. And at that time, I was just told it'll just upset the construction guys too much. They just expect to be paid every week, so just leave it be. And okay, it's larger corporations. I work for a medium-sized family-run firm, not my family. But obviously, if you're working for Chase Manhattan Bank or something, that's a no-brainer. They just, absolutely, we want to save $13 million by doing it twice a month instead of 4 times a month, and so that's kind of how it evolved. I want to talk a little bit about the other locations, because Howard and I researched where was the location in Epcot Center, and we were there a few weeks ago, and while we were out looking at that Norma Nunez prism statue out front, we decided, we should go over there and look at where the Sun Bank branch was. And so we walk over to if you were walking through the turnstiles of Epcot, to your far left, there's an extension of a building, and there are 2 dark glass doors. And we're saying, that must have been it. And I don't know if it's a security office now or what it is. I do see cast members come in and out of it. So we walked over. We were within the permitted areas. There is a roped off area that, no one beyond this point. Cast members only beyond this point. We were on the guest side, looking at it, taking pictures, pointing things out. And the telltale for us was right next to these 2 dark, reinforced glass doors was the Chase ATM. And it was very obvious, this is where the Sun Bank was. As we're standing there, a security guard walks up to
It was a
us, or
cast
was it a
member,
cast member? How? I don't remember. Cast member walks up and says, "Excuse me, can I, I forget what she asked us, but it was basically, what are you guys doing over here? And, you're not supposed to be over here." I'm like, well, actually, we're allowed to be over here. But it looked like we were casing the joint or something, I guess, because she came over and asked what we were doing. And we told her we're looking at the old bank, at which point she was befuddled. And this was a middle-aged woman. This was not a college program kid. And we had a nice couple-minute conversation explaining to her the history of how this used to be a full-service bank when the park opened. And she's like, well, my supervisor sent me over here. I'm going to go over there and tell them that. I bet they don't know it either. I'm like, well, they should listen to our show.
Do we know if they had a safe anywhere that would still be there? Because you can't really cut those. Well, I mean,
safes are incredibly difficult to remove, and I would all but guarantee you that every single one of the former locations has a safe or an iron cage of some sort that is still sitting there.
Because a lot of times the safes are placed on the pad first, and then you build around it because there's no way to get a safe into a building. So, or they're built first.
I can all but guarantee you that most people who buy a former bank building leave the safes in place and just work. I mean, we have a giant safe in ours that hasn't stored any cash or important documents in 15 or 10 years now, since most stuff is digitally done and everything. But when I started working there was a safe within the safe. There was a giant walk-in safe and then another safe in there that had corporate seals, and that plate I had to get every week to sign checks, that signature plate. I mean, all that stuff was in the safe. That ain't ever coming out of that building unless they knock it down.
I've been to a couple different places, which are really interesting, where the safes have been, they take the steel doors off, but obviously the concrete is still there. There's a great one in Northampton. I think now it's some sort of clothing store. There's also in Kittery, Maine, a great bakery, and the safe is still there, and you walk through it to get to the bathroom or whatever, the back of the shop.
Yeah, our Del Frisco's Steakhouse in Philadelphia is in an old, ornate former bank branch. And the safe is a private dining room. You can have dinner down there for 20 people or whatever inside the safe, and it's a whole experience. But yeah, that's, our safe is actually, you'll appreciate this, Todd. Our IT guy disassembled the rolling filed holders that used to be there for sensitive files, and it's our server room now. He's moved all the server equipment in there, and it's semi-fireproof, and he's like, the server will survive no matter what.
Exactly, repurpose them for what you need them for. So,
and then jumping back, the bank branch at Disney MGM Studios, the window is still there. It was outside the turnstiles, and so if you've ever been looking at Hollywood Studios, and to the left, they had that, what's it called, Movie Land, that great little outside stand that had the neon sign over it. It's probably still there. I'm talking about it in the past tense. That sold little souvenirs and bubble wands and stuff now. And to the left of that is bathrooms. And in between those two things out front you'll see an ATM and the telltale sign that this used to be the Sunbank branch here at Disney MGM Studios. And all the same services there, though by the late 80s, they were beginning to be less necessary. I also want to mention, as I did earlier, there was a branch in Celebration as well. When Disney built that planned community, there was, if you were walking towards the Columbia restaurant, you would turn left onto Sycamore Street, walk a block to the next street corner, which is Celebration Avenue, and stop. And you would now be at the home of SunTrust Bank. At this point, SunBank had merged with somebody else to become SunTrust. Are we going into those details now? I don't think so. I don't think anybody cares. But the bank's design was designed by Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown, and they were inspired by a neoclassical style typical of turn-of-the-century banks. The final work, however, is an abstract of a pure neoclassical style, stripped down and flattened out as much as a building of yesterday and today. They wanted to create a civic presence and scale in what is actually a small building, and I am sure someone listening who lives in the vicinity or inside Celebration can tell us if there's still a bank there, and if so, what it is.
I have a Sunbank question. This is for the branch over by the original building over by the the marketplace. I have this recollection of going in there, and it was either 1981 or 1986. And I know I've said on prior episodes that my father also walked us into the old preview center to pay a phone bill. I know that was done. But I have a vague recollection of actually going into the Sun building. I remember, a very white, a little bit of an open atrium. And I remember there being a model in the foyer of the Sunbank building. And I swear it was the model or a model of what the village would be with the people movers and all that. Do you know anything about, or maybe our listeners have seen it or remember it? Anything?
Well, that's funny that you actually saw that in real life, because I've seen pictures of that many times over the years and wondered whatever happened to it. So that's cool that it was actually still there. Now I'm sad I never went over. Yeah, so there was a plan floated around 1976, I think, to do a huge expansion on the village. So we've talked about before, the villas were intended to be, business used by businesses in order to do, retreats and things. So it was never intended to be a consumer, or tourist thing. It was supposed to be sort of like that idea of the original Epcot, where, people that were working for major companies would live in that area. And so they had a very comprehensive plan to do two things. One is to interconnect the housing over there with the village marketplace. But they were also talking about building anywhere between 6 and 11 more buildings, just like the Sunbank building, in a row up against I-4, where the Disney casting building is now, all the way down to where the Disney team building is. And it would have been a series of literally copy pastes of that building that the Sunbank was in, that is now the Partners Bank, down that whole row. And then there was also going to be an intermodal station at the end of that, and a monorail line that came over from Epcot. Well, I guess originally it was probably pre-Epcot. It would have come down the spine and attached to there. Later on, it would have gone through the Epcot branch that was supposed to come out by Horizons and then reach there. So you could take a monorail from Magic Kingdom through Epcot over to Lake Buena Vista, get off, get on a people mover, and then ride the people mover either to where your house was or over to the village. And again, if there's people working in these office buildings, they need a place to live. Let's have them live inside Walt Disney World Village at the townhomes. And it was supposed to be sort of a self-sufficient system where, white collar jobs and families would move over into the townhouses in the villages and then work in those office buildings, being captains of industry or whatever else was going on.
All right. So I am not crazy. This actually there was a model, and I feel privileged to have said that I saw it, and I just can remember these tiny little cars and the monorail.
Yeah, actually, oddly enough, there were two models. There was one of what it would look like in 1970. Oh yeah, 1980. Oh, one was what it would look like in 1980, and then they did another one of what it would look like in the year 2000, with more buildings built in that area, and like a little bit of expansion to the shopping village and some more hotels. So yeah, they had quite a plan. And that was about the same time that they were kicking off the Woodway Transportation Systems as a separate unit too. And so it would have used the enclosed Woodway people movers that they had developed at that time.
Interesting. All right. Well, this is a to-do for our listeners. So if anybody out there has photos or remembers this as well, it'd be great to share that memory with us, and maybe pictures would be fantastic.
Yeah, I have pictures of both of those models that we can put in with the with this episode in the notes.
Yeah, I got to look at it because I can in my head I still can remember what the little area was like. It's fuzzy, but I think it's there. So I'd love to line it up. So cool. Thank you, Hal. Sorry, Sunbank. See, there's always something in every episode.
I have a couple things to fill in
Sure.
here before we tick off probably a few things we wanted to mention, like traveler's checks, etc. When I shared the article about Epcot's opening, Sunbank's branch opening at Epcot Center with the park, that article ended by mentioning that the bank was open from 9 a.m., same hours as the park, 9 a.m. to 10 p.m. Just a year or so later, and this was some stuff Hal had pulled from one of the early guide maps, they had changed a little bit. The bank branch listed here was open daily from 9 to 4. An automated teller machine was also available. Personal checks up to $25 may be cashed at Earth Station after 4 p.m. with proper ID. Financial services were also available at Travelport and Communicore, etc., etc. It does mention at this point also, because it was beyond the first year of American Express, that by this point, MasterCard and Visa were also accepted for purchases of merchandise, tickets, and in full-service restaurants. So where the Amex was usable for more things, they started to allow Visa within about a year. You could start using Visa and MasterCard. But it's funny, the bank branch started closing at 4, and then you just go to Earth Station and you can cash a check for $25 if you want. A second thing I wanted to mention is you might want to know about the fate of the Sunbank and when all that transitioned, because I vividly remember walking in and seeing a functioning bank in Main Street, and it was just like, wow, that's weird. And this is from Mike Lee, who actually just wrote about, he keeps calling 2023 last year, so I guess we have to say 2 years ago now. But at the end of 2023, on Widen Your World, Mike Lee shared a little bit about Sunbank on Main Street, USA. Sunbank, of course, became SunTrust. For those of you, and I won't go through the litany of purchases since then, but if you have a bank account today at Truist, that is the successor. That was the eventual purchaser of what was SunTrust. So there's a Truist probably 5 miles from my house. So if I really wanted a legacy Sunbank account, I guess I could go open an account there. Mike says in his article that prior to Sunbank opening in 1977 on Main Street, he thinks that space was used for booking guided tours of the park.
Actually, so I do know what was absolutely there.
Okay, go ahead.
It was originally a security office, oddly enough, as the one at Epcot turned out to be later. But yeah, it was originally a security office. When the bank came in 1976 or 77,
77, yeah,
they got booted to upstairs in the same building.
Okay,
but yeah,
that's good to know. But they did have you could book plaid guided tours, not that would get you on any rides, but for something like $6 a person, you were able to have usually the women in their riding crops or the guys in their plaid outfits. They would take you on a tour of the park and point out landscaping and different things. And here's Adventureland, and this is what this building's based on. And so I'm sure that those tours were also organized there in that City Hall area, which is why Mike probably thought that. So Sunbank closed that building, closed the bank branch, June 23rd, 1997. And it's funny because it's June 24th, 77 to June 23rd, 97. So clearly they were on a dated lease. And after Sunbank left the building, it became the Main Street Gallery, which opened on September 6th. So it was a 3-month refurb selling Disney-themed art and collectibles. Years later, it was converted to the Main Street Chamber of Commerce and began handling the park's lost and found, which were previously based in City Hall. Now, he adds a little bit of extra here. I'll skip over his parents using the Sunbank branch downtown. But Mike says he opened his first bank account at Sunbank's Windermere branch in 1985. By the end of that year, he was working at Walt Disney World and cashing his weekly checks at Main Street USA's Sunbank branch using the backstage cast member walk-up window. He got a $3,000 loan in 1988 from Sunbank to buy his first personal computer, mostly to start writing books, which he never finished, and to create document files using the Disney information he's been collecting since 5th grade. And can we just give a shout out to how valuable Mike Lee is to all of us for filling in blanks and the stuff that he's chronicled. And I mean, he is just a phenomenal resource out there for all of us. So he's Widen Your World. He's got a blog. He's the Facebook page that he's got, Widen Your World, always is putting a ton of interesting stuff up there. But yeah, so he kept using the USA Sunbank to cash post Walt Disney World job paychecks up until 1994 because he was an annual pass holder when he finally started doing direct deposit. He said the line to see a teller was never very long, and walking up to the old-fashioned counter with its big antique safe behind the desk reminded him of the Apple Dumpling Gang. And according to one of the Widen Your World readers, Sunbank was always our first stop at Magic Kingdom, as my mom would hop in there to cash some traveler's checks. And we'll have to include a link to this because I know you had pulled a few when we were talking about this ahead of time, but he has a tremendous number of photos of outside, the artwork elevation, and the inside of the bank. And the pictures I've seen of the inside of the bank was always the one that they shot in there of Scrooge McDuck conducting a transaction at the window that was included in the Birnbaum books.
Oh.
And that's where I would always have seen like, oh, that's inside the bank. And Birnbaum's always had like a short write-up on it that basically said you can cash your traveler's checks. Todd, have we explained traveler's checks already? We've been at this a while.
We've touched on them in other episodes. I remember talking about how I had them on my trips, but let's just give a 5-minute refresher course. I think would be due.
Yeah, traveler's checks are real simple. In exchange for your cash, American Express was the most famous one in the United States, but there were some others that issued them. You do them for $25, $50, $100. You take them with you, just in your billfold like anything else. The big key was there were little receipts on the end of it, or you hand wrote down the serial numbers for each one, so that if you were traveling primarily in foreign countries, but even around the United States, wherever, and your traveler's checks were lost or stolen, as probably 50 commercials starring Carl Malden would assure you, you could call American Express, report that they were lost or stolen. You could give them the serial numbers, and provided you were not committing a scam, because they would know if you'd already signed and turned them in somewhere and gotten cash for them, they would replace those overnight, or in some cases, wire you the money immediately. There were American Express travel offices all over the world. Same thing with Thomas Cook, which is still in airports and was all over the world. Primarily, you'd see them a lot in Europe. They would issue traveler's checks as well. There was a Euro check program for a while that was backed by the collective European countries that sunset itself, I want to say, in maybe the early 90s or around 2000. But the whole idea was taking the worry out of losing your wad of cash while you were traveling. If you've ever seen National Lampoon's European Vacation, Clark W. Griswold goes in and tells the robbers who are robbing the American Express office there that they had lost everything and needed their money. And I think he said it was $2,500 in traveler's checks. And of course, the robber just hands him like $5,000 or something like that. Oh, for your trouble. That's not how it really worked. But it was a security measure. And but you had to be smart enough to record the serial numbers in order for it to work.
Well, the other thing is when you purchase them at the bank, you had to sit down and sign each one of the checks individually
in front of them, right?
With your signature in front of them.
Yeah.
Because when you went to cash them in, you would countersign and sign your name again, and the signatures had to match in order for the merchant to accept the traveler's check.
Well, the interesting thing about that is in my first trip to Europe, and maybe even my second, what I recall was not getting traveler's checks. I didn't listen to Carl Malden, but what I did do was before I left, I went to my bank here and said that I wanted to get British pounds before I left. And they said that was a special order, and I would just need to tell them the amount that I wanted, and that they would get them in like 5 days, and then I would be able to come and pick them up basically as a withdrawal from my account. And so I recall doing that twice, where I would have my, whatever it is, 400 pounds or whatever in my in my wallet before I left the United States. So I would have cash when I got to the Great Britain. Traveler's checks, credit cards and debit cards and all that made them obsolete. You didn't need them anymore.
And the prepaid credit card. That probably is one of the big things at first that killed the traveler's check.
Yeah. And actually, it's fantastic for the banks too, right? Because the thing about the reloadable credit card or the prepaid card is that they got your money, and the percent chance that you're going to use it down to the exact amount is pretty low. And on a percentage basis, if you leave a penny on there and they sell millions and millions of these things, they're making some good extra cash. They got a nice return on their investment.
This is the whole Superman 3 thing, right?
Oh, if he's rounded up to a penny, yeah. And actually, Brian and I were chatting today, too, about the Christmas clubs and the vacation clubs where you would, every week or so, they take a couple bucks out of your paycheck, and at the 49th or 50th month, they'd send you a check, and, hey, here's your money. The killer part is that, Brian, you sent me a link to one that exists today, and there's no interest rate. You're giving... So you're not even making money.
There is no interest rate usually on them now.
Yes.
And they are, these days they're more prominent with credit unions because credit unions are usually attached to some industry or business or some set of employees, and it's seen as a benefit that automatically every week out of your check will come $5 or $10. It's an account, you put it in at the end of the year. When they cash it out, which is usually in November. My mother did a Christmas club and vacation club every year through her credit union when we were growing up. We were on a shoestring budget, and I've paid tribute to her at countless family functions and Christmases about when we were growing up, I know we didn't have any money, but somehow on Christmas morning we came down and it was it was like we were the best kids in the world because Santa just brought us so much stuff. And I never, to this day, I don't know how they did it. But, a lot of it was my mom working hard and putting whatever it was, $10 or $15 a week away, enough to buy a couple weeks for us at a rental house at the Jersey Shore and get our beach weeks in, and Christmas morning come down to more presents than we deserved. And that was just, they were just little tiny savings accounts, but you couldn't draw on them early. Like the bank, the money was there and the bank would issue you the check in like November 15th in time for the Black Friday sales. What else? Free pens on lollipops.
Lollipops at the drive-through. Hey, all right. If we're talking about banking, did Sunbank did they have a drive-through there? Let's talk about drive-throughs. Did they have it?
They had the drive-through at the building
They
downtown
did.
Disney.
Okay, so let's talk.
Yeah,
They still do. It's still
you
there.
You couldn't take the horse carriage up to the window on Main Street and get your cash out.
Hey, hook it to the left there.
No, I'm thinking because as a kid, my passbook, as I mentioned earlier, I remember going there, and my mom did a lot of drive-through banking. That was her thing. She also wrote a lot of checks at the Acme, and she had a check cashing card.
I was going to say, only if you had your check cashing card.
She was legit. She had her check cashing card. But I always remember the pneumatic machines, and a lot of people have seen these in museums now, and they're used all over. They're used quite a bit in large office buildings to move papers and things around. Not like the mail drop from like the 85th floor down to the basement where your envelope is going down a chute, and
if you've ever seen the movie Elf,
yes,
you know what we're talking about.
Right. So you would pull
Sends
up,
it.
and there's always a red or a green light telling you which bay was open in the drive-through, much like you have today. But a lot of them have just been replaced by ATMs, and generally the only ones available today, at least around here, are the ones that are the actual window in the bank.
Yeah.
But
our closest bank still uses.
they still
the
use the
tubes.
tubes. Those machines they make a funky
Yeah,
noise.
the one TD Bank here still does.
Oh man, they are so cool.
And ours had little pods where the teller would sit, like almost like lock the door behind him, and those got replaced with the tubes.
Interesting. So
no loose change in the
that's
tube.
right. You don't want it all flying around.
That's right. Hey, I'll give you one side thing. So when automatic teller machines were first introduced, Todd, you talked about a lot of the security measures involved. So the very very first one actually didn't use a card at all. They actually laced the checks with radioactive elements, and then when you stuck the check in, it would read the fact that there was that radioactive isotope on the paper check, and then know that you were cool, and it would give you money. So that's
interesting.
A system. That was a system in the UK that was introduced in '69.
Okay.
That was the very first ATM attached to a bank, and then a bank in Philadelphia bought 6 of those, but they got beat, I think, by another machine that came from the U.S. That debuted in New York, and those cards, because this was pre-magnetic stripe, we've seen those pictures of the old cards for doors with the holes in them. So it was like that. So it was a slotted, it was a punch card basically in a plastic card that you would put in, and the teeth would come through, and that's how your individual ID numbers were placed on the card.
So I wonder if that was a. So I don't know if people realize this, but the font on your bottom of your check that has your check number, your account number, and your routing number. Micker number, right. It's Micker because it means magnetic ink character recognition, and that's actually magnetic ink. So they weren't far off with the isotope thing. They just don't lick your checks, though. You're gonna become like the watchmaker girls, right?
When I transitioned from our pre-printed safeguard days, dot matrix checks to the laser printer checks, I had to get a Micker toner cartridge.
Did you?
Wow. That in fact I probably still have an old one somewhere, but it would go in, and I'd have to be careful to put it in to print the checks, and then remember to swap it out again for the other 6 days of the week when I was just using my computer to do other things, because the Micker toner was about 3 times as expensive as just the regular, black ink toner. But yeah, they make Micker toner cartridges for a lot of those things. I also want to point out, since we were talking about the ATMs, if you're into early entertainment, a trope, I guess they would call it, common plot device, especially on sitcoms or comedy films, and I'm going to date it. I don't know when the first instance would be, but I'd say 1980, 81, you'll probably find in a film or television episode oh my God, the ATM machine has suddenly spit out $8,000 at me.
Oh, yeah.
I feel like there's an episode of the TV show Alice where Mel Sharples has that happen to him, and he's like tucking it in his hat, and There were countless others. You'll see it in movies, possibly even in anytime where computers were going crazy. But, like a Superman 3 or something. There are elements where one of the comedic things that happens is all of a sudden ATMs start throwing money out at you.
Yeah.
And I'm going to date, I'm guessing the last time it was used as a plot device would be around 1992 in Terminator 2. The young John Connor's there. Sarah Connor's done.
Easy money.
He uses was an Apple Newton or something?
Atari portfolio.
Atari portfolio, and he puts the magnetic card still attached to the portfolio, and he goes like, "Here, let me watch this," and he pushes a few buttons, and $800 spits out, and he's like, "All right, we got cash, let's go," and it's just fascinating to me that and I'm not sure how much beyond that you've really seen it, but if somebody's out there familiar with it, we can probably pinpoint the first and last time it ever happened as a plot device in anything. But
that's funny because that's a technology that actually radically changed at some point too. Because when the very first ATMs came out, they could only give out one particular increment of money, or maybe two at the most. So they would preload cardboard envelopes with $20 bills and $50 bills, and you would say what you wanted, and then it would actually come out in a tray inside of the cardboard envelope, and you would take the money out, and then they would ask you to recycle the paper tray back into a slot somewhere so that way they could use it again. And so just to be able to freely count money, I'm sure came on with more cameras and better character recognition, but at first you had a preset amount that you could take out. And the other funny thing about ATMs is they worked really hard to brand them. Mm-hmm. Bankers were really concerned that people only wanted to walk up and talk to human tellers. The idea of the machines, you interfacing with the machine, they considered that odd. And they didn't think people would go for it. So a lot of times they use novelty names for the ATM machines in order to get people, make them friendly and be more comfortable. So some of them just had very plain names, like Sunbank's was Sunbank 24. Or, there was the Anytime Teller, Instant Cash. Bank of America's was called the Bank of Meriteller, which really rolls off the tongue.
Philadelphia one that claims to be the originator. Was MAC, the Money Access Center. So
and if you had the card, was the Money Access card. They played off the MAC really well.
And Philadelphians, you will still see some of us say, "Oh, I have to go tap MAC."
Tap MAC.
That's doing an ATM.
So that was one of the first networks.
So
that was originally you only had access to the money in your bank. You didn't have access to the money in the other ones. Mac was one of the first networked banks where I went all the way up to I read Mac was in New Hampshire too. Oh, wow. So you could get money out from any of the connected banks within the system. Right,
so
I liked there were a bunch of them that were named after people. So Fidelity National Bank of Baton Rouge had Abby.
Oh.
Then there was Harvey Wallbanker. He was from the First National Bank of Moline, Illinois.
This is like
Gerard Bank here had George.
Yeah. George, that's
See,
right.
This is like companies now. They're naming their AI chatbots. Hi, I'm Eva. I'm going to help you. Okay,
exactly.
So it's the same thing.
There was Tilly the Teller from the First National Bank of Atlanta. Jeannie from Fifth Third.
Right. We had the Genie machine here.
Jenny from the Janice Bank in Flint, Michigan. In D.C., the Madison National Bank had Dolly, which was a drawing of Dolly Madison. And then there were some animals too. So Central Trust in Cincinnati had Owl because you could access it at nighttime when the bank would normally be closed. But it was really funny to see all of these branded. In Canada, they actually did a deal with, I can't remember which bank it was now. They called their banking ATM machines Johnny Cash. And they actually got Johnny Cash to be in the commercials.
That's
for it.
fantastic.
So we're definitely adding some Johnny Cash commercials to the next movie night.
Exactly.
I'll have to add.
put those in there.
Two sides that came to mind tonight. That I
Can
didn't
I
mention
just
at the time.
throw a
Yeah,
public
go
service
ahead.
announcement in there too? I saw that there was a trend, God knows what brought this on, some sort of trend that people were taking their credit cards and running to ATMs and taking out the max amount of their card, because you can get money out of your credit card
As a cash advance, yes.
Exactly. And the banks won't catch up with you. So what people were doing is they were going to the multiple of these things and taking out $5,000. Anyway, long story short, all these people thought it was free money, because they're not going to come after you for it. You can run away with it. It's cash. They didn't understand it. And don't do that, please. Do not go and take all that cash out thinking you're not. You can look up it was recent. It was like within the past year.
Wasn't the idea that somehow the systems weren't interconnected?
Something like that. And the banks,
it was like the old fast pass machines where you'd get there were a few people that knew that fast pass machine isn't on the same system as that one, so I can get two fast passes at
and then
the
the
same
people
time.
were pissed when their bank account statement said you owe us $60,000. So
Yeah.
don't do that.
Yeah, they
Don't
went
fall
after
for
them for the
anything.
money.
Yeah, exactly. So just a little public service
Two
announcement.
things that came to mind tonight. My father, who lived to be 63 years old before leaving far too soon in 2004, never had an ATM card, never had a debit card. Just, I don't need one. I'm not getting one. And he never, ever, ever used a cash machine for the duration of his life. Now, his office, for the last 85, 95, 95, for the last 20 years of his life, was in the bank was in the parking lot of the office complex he worked in. So he would leave the office for lunch every day. Stopping at the bank was like you or I stopping in anywhere on a day-to-day basis. So he legitimately really didn't need it, and didn't understand why we all had them. When you were talking about the progression of credit cards in one of my teenage jobs in high school at West Coast Video, we had once they went to the magnetic strip machines that would then dial up the modem. So they had to have a phone line attached to them, and you'd swipe the stripe, and then it would run through and either approve or decline the card. One night I was signing some guy with his family that came in for an account, and back then in order to get the account at West Coast Video to be able to rent videos, we had to have a credit card authorization on file before your first rental. And they'd authorize for $50 or $100 or whatever, just in case you broke the tape or made off with it or whatever. And that card would stay on file. They knew how long it was valid for, and it was really just a very minor security level. So I am setting up this guy's account, his wife and son or whatever standing there, and I swipe the card to do the authorization, and instead of saying approved or declined, it comes up call bank.
Oh,
is what the little digital readout said. So I call the manager / owner's son over, who was a pretty intense guy, and it's like, Jim, it says call bank. Like, what? So he quick picks up the phone and dials whatever number was on there. He'd been through this before, and the bank told him to cut the card up right there on the spot. And so while the guy's standing there, and I'm telling you that my recollection, and maybe it's enhanced over the years, but I remember the guy looking like a burly biker dude. Jim took out a giant pair of scissors and cut the card up right in front of the guy's face. And the guy's like, what are you doing? He's like, the bank told us to seize the card, to destroy it, seize the card and destroy it. I can't give it back to you. I have to destroy it, And naturally, he was obviously embarrassed and angry. And I have to say, in my retail working career, that may have been the most uncomfortable I ever was. That the credit card company was so angry at him that they weren't just going to decline the charge. They wanted you to cut it up in front of his face.
That's funny.
I saw that twice while I was working at the record store where we had to do that. They know exactly what you're talking about. And the people were not happy.
So I mean, it wouldn't happen these days. No matter what card it is, they would just decline it. But
right.
Now, what's interesting is that there was a store growing up that my mom took us to, clothing, kids' clothes and shoes and stuff. And I remember going in there and she'd present her card and they couldn't afford or didn't want to pay or whatever the terminal. So they were still using the impression machine. So every time my mom went in there, the gentleman had this very thin paper book, very, very thin pages on newsprint or thin newsprint. And he would look up the card number. And this thing must have been sent out weekly, I believe. You would subscribe to it, would come in the mail. And those were all the card numbers that were fraudulent or would not need. So it was a very primitive way of checking whether or not the card was valid, which is just, it's just, mind blowing. You think of the how there wasn't more fraud back then because people were so much more trusting, but it's just, amazing that went on.
Well, I could actually, as a build on to that, I remember being at places where they would have a little file of people that passed bum checks. And a lot of times they'd have photocopies of the check or of a driver's license.
Tape them on the wall.
And they'd have to flip through to see whether the person was like the notorious, check bouncer.
Exactly, writing checks. Oh, goodness.
Well, I will say, I hope all of this makes you feel, demonstrates how much easier it is now to go to the parks and in order to, and just go out and do what you want to do and not have to think about this. This is the one part where I feel like things actually are easier now in theme parks than it was before. You didn't have to bring traveler's checks or a certain amount of cash and worry about losing them or worry about getting pickpocketed and someone's walking off with, the whole $500 you had for your trip. You're free to walk up to almost any machine now and you can either, as JT uses his watch, or use a magic band, or use,
credit card,
your ATM card, and just everywhere, universally throughout the park.
And there's a shift there too, by the way. Disney, you can still use cash. Six Flags, Cedar Fair, most of those places have gone cashless.
Yeah,
where you can't even use cash. Which I don't necessarily love, but they just don't want people the risk of handling money anymore.
Can't get airline points with cash, so I like it.
You and I have the same thought process. Every time even there's cash in my pocket, I'm paying for a meal. I'm like, 3 times points here.
Exactly.
Points. Exactly. Can't pass it up. I'll pay it later. But I do want to say to Hal's point, it does take a level of stress and worry away, but it also takes a level of restraint away, and it makes it there's a lot of these subscriptions now that TV channels or whatever that you sign up for that are just hitting a card or hitting an account.
Yep.
That used to be really rare, where it would only be a gym or something like that you'd be like, oh my God, I forgot I still have that membership. I got to cancel it, or that magazine subscription. Now, computer software, almost all the entertainment you consume. At one point, I think they've stopped it now, JT, but there were people selling cars where you had to subscribe to your heated seats to work and stuff like. I mean.
Yeah, that was BMW. It didn't hit.
Yeah, it didn't go well.
They've been
I was just gonna say, I think there's also the human element that you've taken out of the equation. The transaction has gone into this void where before there used to be a greeting and you're buying this and you're handing the cash, and there was this felt exchange that is no longer there.
But even the highway travel now with the toll by plate. You're traveling along and you have no idea that, oh my God, I just spent $47 on tolls because you didn't have to stop anywhere and give anybody $47.
Yeah.
That's just to get from Orlando International to Walt Disney World.
You're not, I mean, it isn't that, it's that stretch is actually still pretty affordable. But, when I drove just a few weeks ago when I drove back from Florida. There's stretches in Virginia and Maryland, if you don't want to be on I-95 in stop and go traffic for no reason whatsoever, you get in these express lanes, and it's $15 to go the next 10 miles. But I mean, at that point, I would pay anything to be flying by these people over here on the right. But all of that, drains and the parks. It is so easy. You get in the app, and I don't want to wait in line for Guardians of the Galaxy. I'll buy this Lightning Lane pass for $27.
It kind of all started with the Magic Band, I think, too. That was just
was all part
tap
of the
it and almost like cruise cards. It's not real money. It's
So there's a huge downside to it, and I am a preacher of keeping a mixture, always carrying cash. I know it makes me a bit of a dinosaur, but if you're a traveler, even if you're not, cash gets you out of bad situations. Whether it's a parking lot, whether somebody's trying to mug you and you have $20 or $40 to hand them, if you're in a city somewhere. But I mean, I can remember times where, we're going to park somewhere and they weren't going to let you in, and say, well, will you let me in for $40? Yeah, all right, well, there's a spot for you over here. Cash, I always tell people, cash can buy your way out of problems, especially when you're traveling.
Yep.
So it's always a good idea to have some cash on you. You don't need to walk around with hundreds of dollars, but it's even if you see somebody you want to help sleeping on the street, it's nice to have a $5 bill to be able to hand somebody. Because most bums don't take Apple Pay or Venmo or...
Oh, goodness. Well, gentlemen, thank you very much for turning the clocks back, and hopefully our listeners will enjoy this as much as they enjoyed the film episode, because we did diverge into the technologies, but part of the show was also reliving what it was like back in the day, so to speak. And a lot of these technologies over the years are going to be forgotten, so when the four of us are long gone, somebody will pull out this podcast episode. Oh, can you believe this?
Can you believe when people used to do podcasts?
Yeah. Now things just appear. I don't know. So, but how you made some new shirts. I wanted to make sure we called those out. In fact, you have a hot projector action shirt that's going on too, based on a 8mm projector box.
We had our movie nights, and I love that so much. We always joke about you getting the projector set up, so we got the hot projector, and we also did a retro WDW take on the Sunbank logo.
So awesome.
For this one. So it's like a little mashup of Sunbank and retro WDW. So
you can get those over at retro WDW/support us. And I know a lot of you have purchased the Muppets 3D ornament, still available. We've got a handful left. Head over to lbvhistory.org/donate. And for $25, we'll send you the 3D ornament. Gentlemen, you got yours. I know how you didn't get yours. I didn't know where to send it. We mentioned that last time. But JT, you got all the ornaments behind you. Is it hanging up in your office there? You got it? Excellent.
Yeah, I got a few back here.
Mine is actually hanging on the curio cabinet in front of me.
There we go.
When it came
Christmas year round. So.
My Epcot fountain.
Yeah, I see that. You got that's a rare piece there.
Almost all of them arrived in one piece too.
Yeah, we only had 2 breakage, and
this one's there's a little bit of a with the 3D effect.
Yeah,
there's a little bit of a fragility.
There is
possibility, but it was great.
You can always glue them in place too if you don't feel like it. You can always just glue it on. So. All right. Well, gentlemen, thank you again very much. We will be back with our next episode. We're going to be diving into the music of Epcot Center. So hold on for that. That'll be coming up soon. And as always, we appreciate a shout out in iTunes or wherever your favorite podcast app is. Give us a review there and a shout out. And with that, we'll see you on the next episode. And Brian, take us out.
Follow the Lake Buena Vista Historical Society on Twitter and Instagram at LBV History, and on the web at lbvhistory.org. For all things Retro Disney World, including exclusive merchandise, visit us on the web at retrowdw.com and on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at RetroWDW. And follow our hosts, Todd McCartney, on Twitter at WDWMS, Hal Bowers on Twitter and Instagram at GoAwayGreen, JT Cougar on Twitter at LS1JT, and on YouTube at Rubber City Motoring, and on the web at rubbercitymotoring.com. And you can find me on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Brian P. Miles. Retro Disney World is the monthly podcast of the Lake Buena Vista Historical Society, a nonpartisan, nonprofit, tax-exempt 501c3 organization, and is not affiliated in any way with the Walt Disney Corporation or any of its subsidiary or affiliated entities.
Get the money. Uncle Scrooge's money. Shh. Get the money. Talk. What's the police? I told you to be quiet.